Hi everybody, it's Laura from Green Tree, and on this lovely, somewhat gray and blustery Tuesday, I'm talking about crock pots. Also slow cookers is the other name that many of us will call them by. For those of you that already have them and love them, this will be kind of old news, but if you haven't experimented with one much, or if you kind of have shoved it to the back of the cupboard and not pulled it out lately, this might get you a little inspired to start doing something new with it, now that the weather is so conducive to these crock pot recipes. So, first tip, and this is straight from our deli manager, don't under-season. So think about it this way. You have to include liquid in your crock pot in order to keep things from burning. So let's say you have a potato, and you've got a potato in your crock pot, and you've got a half a cup of water in your crock pot, and you add just enough salt for the potato. Well, a bunch of that salt is going to go out into the water, and you're going to end up with bland broth and a bland potato. So, in addition to making sure there's enough liquid, you have to make sure that you do not under-season when using the crock pot. You want to have enough seasoning for the item that you're cooking, whether it's a vegetable, a meat, a starch, it doesn't matter, and then also for the liquid. So think about double the seasoning. Seasoning for your liquid, seasoning for the actual food that you're cooking. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with something really bland that you're going to have to season and cook more once you take it out before you eat it. Another thing, a crock pot typically has an inner portion that sits inside of a heating element. And you can take that inner portion out to store the food. Do not take that piece and try to cook with it directly on the stovetop. There are a few different models where you can remove that center portion and cook on it, but unless it expressly says that on the packaging when you buy it, don't do it, because it can melt, it can crack, you can end up with all of your food running right down into the burner on your stove and just end up with a huge mess and a wrecked crock pot. Oh, sorry Eric, there are crock pots out in the world, but today we're just talking about crock pots and slow cookers. So, different topic entirely. So yeah, enough liquid. Make sure you extra season, and don't try and cook in that piece of insert that goes inside your crock pot. Also, once you have made food in the crock pot, taken that insert out and refrigerated it, do not put that center ceramic piece back into your crock pot and turn it on and try to reheat your food in it. If you try to reheat your food in that refrigerated thing, it's going to crack. You're going to end up breaking it, and it probably won't come up to temperature fast enough either. So even if you get lucky and it doesn't crack, you're probably still going to ruin your food and make it unsafe to eat. So don't try and reheat in the crock pot. Scoop it out, put it into a pot, do it on the stovetop, take out a single portion, put it in the microwave, or just eat it cold, but don't reheat it in the crock pot. Another thing with temperature. Okay, so let's say you were going to do a meat-based thing, like maybe you're going to make some spaghetti, for example. This is thawed. This is soft. You can put this directly in the crock pot if you want to. It's not a bad idea to sear or cook your meat in a separate container first if you're putting meat in the crock pot in order to get better flavor and texture. But with something like ground beef or any ground meat, if it is thawed fully, you can put it right in there and start cooking it. However, if this were frozen and you put this right in the crock pot, that is an excellent way to give yourself some food poisoning. Don't do it. Putting frozen meat in your crock pot and expecting it to fully cook up to temperature in time, it's not safe, so just don't do that. Either thaw it first or pre-cook it partway on the stove before putting it in the crock pot. That will also help, that searing step will help prevent toughness in your meat in the finished product. Another way to prevent that is to include, especially with beef, some kind of an acid in your cooking liquid. I like to do things that are tomato based, like I'll do a spaghetti sauce or a chili, something that's got a little bit of that acidity from the tomatoes. You can also use red wine in your cooking, and that'll work well on tough vegetables too. It'll help just break it down a little bit better, give you a softer finished texture. So don't put frozen meat in your crock pot. Honestly, don't put frozen veggies in your crock pot either. They just won't come up to temperature fast enough. Now, let's say you're doing a range of different vegetables. Let's say you've got something like potatoes and something like arugula. If you were cooking these on the stovetop, you would not put them in the crock pot at the same time. You wouldn't put them in the pan, rather, at the same time. So you can't put them in the crock pot at the same time either. This kind of thing, potatoes, carrots, onions, put this in at the beginning and go ahead and leave it there for 8 to 10 hours and it's going to be completely fine. Put some arugula in the crock pot and leave it for 8 to 10 hours and you're going to have kind of a paste, best case scenario. It's just going to disintegrate on you. So what you want to do is put this kind of thing, these hard, tough foods, meats and kind of firm vegetables in at the beginning and go ahead and leave those all day or for your 4 to 6 hours depending on whether you're cooking on high or low. And we'll get to that in a second. This kind of thing though, this delicate stuff, you want this to go in at the end of the cooking process. So when you get home and everything smells wonderful because you've been cooking all day even though you were out and about, that's the time to throw in a couple handfuls of your arugula or asparagus. Delicate things like dairy. Oops, sorry about that, I hit my tripod. Dairy is also something that should go in at the end of the cooking process. It can be okay to have it in from the beginning, but you have to be really careful and follow the recipe because it's pretty easy for it to hit too high a temperature and curdle. So when I have a recipe that's going to have any kind of creamy thing in it, even if I'm using a non-dairy milk, say making a potato soup or something, I'll cook the potatoes, the broth, the onions, garlic, all of that all day, and then just add the splash of milk, whether it's dairy or non-dairy, at the end and just let it heat up. Because that way you don't have to worry about it curdling or separating or burning, because it is possible to burn things in a crock pot, especially if you don't have enough liquid, like I mentioned at the beginning. Now, when you go to cook things in your crock pot, I've talked a little bit about it coming up to temperature. When you go to eat your food, check it with a thermometer. It doesn't really matter what kind of thermometer you want to use. I have one of those long probe types that you would use just in your kitchen to check a roast or something else. And I'll insert that in. And you want it to be at least 165. The temperature that it has to hit might vary a little depending on the food that you're putting in there. But if you're hitting 165, you're probably safe. You're going to go ahead though, and besides making sure it's at the right temperature at the end, you want to make sure it's hitting temperature fast enough at the beginning. And a good way to do that is when you're putting in the stuff that you're starting with, whether it be grains or meats or hard veggies, whatever the liquid is, while I'm prepping my dish, I turn the crock pot up to high. Even though I'm going to be gone for 10 hours and I'm going to leave it cooking all day, I turn it on to high while I'm doing my prep. When I finish and everything is in the crock pot, I'll turn it back down to low to leave it all day. So that way, I'm heating things up quickly and I don't have to worry so much about that dangerous temperature threshold that can happen at the beginning of the cooking process. Because that's when the most danger comes cooking with a crock pot, is if your food doesn't get up to temperature fast enough. The other thing that you can do with that is have your liquid be hot. Pour in hot broth, hot water, warm up your wine, whatever liquid you're using. If that's already hot going in, it won't matter so much that your vegetables were refrigerated or that your meat was and should be refrigerated before it goes in. So yeah, that's another thing you can do is use that high temperature setting and hot liquid at the beginning of that cooking process. Just set a timer or something because you don't want to accidentally leave the house without turning it down. That's a great way to come home to a really nasty smelling briquette in your house, so don't do that. Finally, some things that you can put in crock pots. So I covered some of the basic practices, but I just want you to know there's a lot more that you can do besides just spaghetti sauce or stew. Grains are actually great. This is millet. You could also do something like kamut or steel cut oats, and you could do a breakfasty dish that way, like a porridge or a stew that is actually thickened by the grains that are in it. With the grains or beans, you can do beans, especially if you're doing like a chili or a heavy soup. You do want to make sure though that you have the amount of water they actually need to cook, plus a little bit more, because even though they have that lid that stays on there, there's not a lot of evaporation. This is a very long cooking process for the most part, and so you want to make sure you have a little more water than you think so that you don't end up with this charred layer on the bottom of the crock pot, especially if you're actually cooking on high. Oh, and I didn't specify that. So if something takes an hour or so to cook when you're cooking it in a pot on the stovetop, it's a great candidate for cooking all day in the crock pot. So if it takes an hour in stovetop, you can do it for 8 to 12 hours typically in a crock pot on that low setting. Some of them are fancier than others. There's usually almost always a high, a low, and a warm. Warm is for something that's already cooked. Don't put a bunch of raw ingredients into a crock pot, leave it all day on warm, and expect to come home to food that is A, safe to eat, and B, tasty. It just isn't warm enough. That low is for those long, all-day, 8 to 12-hour cooking. Now, if you want to make something like mac and cheese, which is actually pretty popular to make in the crock pot, or an Alfredo, really any kind of pasta dish, you're probably going to have a shorter cooking time, something more like 4 to 6 hours. And if you're using the high setting, those dishes that would take the 8 to 12 are going to be more like 4 to 6, and the ones that would be 4 to 6 are going to be more like 2 or 3. So you want to check a few recipes the first time you're making a type of food in the crock pot and get an idea of what that cooking time is like before you just leave the house all day and hope to come home to something edible. But you can make, like I said, these kind of grains and porridge dishes. You can do stews, chilies, sauces, mac and cheese. It's a great way to do hot mulled wine or cider, or even hot cocoa for a get-together. So you're having some people over, you fill it up, you get some milk and some cocoa mix. Probably don't put the marshmallows on the top because they'll just dissolve. Have them in a little dish next to it. And you don't have to pay any attention to it. You heat it up once on the stove, set it on warm, and for the whole duration of whatever party or get-together, your cider, your wine, your hot cocoa is hot and ready to go. People can just go ladle out a serving whenever they want. So that's a really useful feature that sometimes people don't think of. Let's see. I'll make tacos in mine a lot, like a shredded taco. You can do that with chicken, beef, or jackfruit. You would want to adjust the temperature kind of according to which of those you were cooking. But that has a lot of nice liquid in it that you can later use to make soups or stews. And it is something that will cook evenly and slowly over a long period of time. It's already got the acid from the tomatoes, so you don't have to worry about a tough finished product. Meatloaf is a great one to make in crock pots. I have not tried making a vegan or vegetarian meatloaf in a crock pot, but I'm sure you can do it. You're probably just going to have a little bit different of a finished texture because it's not going to want to bind as well with the liquid that's in the bottom. So you might have to have it on a little rack with liquid in the base. So that would be fun to experiment with sometime. Let's see, trying to make sure I didn't forget any here. Shredded pork, chicken and dumplings, or tofu and dumplings. The key with that is similar to the arugula. You don't add this at the beginning. You don't add the dumpling mix at the beginning of that long cook time. You add it half an hour, maybe 40 minutes before you want to eat. Turn it back up to high, drop your dough in on top, and go ahead and let those dumplings cook. And then, you can also do desserts. And here's one last tip from our deli manager before I head off into the afternoon. If you are going to make desserts, things like bread puddings, cakes, that type of soft, bready kind of dish, there is a heating element in the base of the crock pot. You typically want to have a layer or two of aluminum foil between that heating element and the pot itself, or else that one area will get really warm and you're going to end up burning the milk components in the dish. Whether they're dairy or non-dairy, they tend to scorch pretty easily. And if you don't want to end up with a cake that has one little burned spot on it, you want to have a little bit of interference between that heating element and the dish itself. And last note, Instapot, crock pot. Not the same thing. You can get an Instapot with a slow cooker setting. I actually have one and have used it, and it works pretty well. It's not as consistent as a classic slow cooker in terms of maintaining that temperature over a very long period of time, but the Instapot is actually a pressure cooker, not a slow cooker. A pressure cooker, it raises the atmospheric pressure inside of that container as though you were going to like a different place on sea level, but more extreme, so that it makes the cooking time much, much shorter by increasing the pressure under which the food is cooking. You can't do that in a slow cooker. There's no seal to hold that pressure in. So while you can make many of the recipes you can make in a slow cooker in an Instapot on the right setting, you usually can't make the Instapot recipes in a slow cooker. It's not going to turn out the same way. They don't have the same type of functionality. So just keep that in mind when you're looking up recipes, that Instapot and slow cooker are not interchangeable. So I hope that gave you guys some inspiration, that you'll experiment a little bit, drag that slow cooker crock pot out of the back of the cupboard. Like I said, it's beautiful weather out for it now. And there's that feeling of accomplishment when you get home and it already smells like you've been cooking all day. So anyway, I'm gonna pull my slow cooker out, and I hope that you guys do the same. Have a great Tuesday, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.